All right, everyone, it's time to talk about Bernie Sanders and his ugly, noble, savage mythology tweet that no leftist is calling him out. And in fact, if you point this out on the tweet, they'll call you out instead. And for some reason, pointing out that he's using a Romanticist-era trope about the brave or the redskin or something, apparently that itself is evidence of bigotry or extremism. So I'm going to read his stupid tweet here because that's exactly what it is. It'll probably make some of you laugh if you've studied any sociology. Now, Native Americans have taught us we cannot destroy nature and survive. When I am president, they will get more than a seat at the table. They will be part of the decision-making, live from the Meskwaki settlement in Iowa. There are so many things wrong with this tweet that recounting them individually would be its own video. No, Native Americans have not taught us that. You're homogenizing an entire group of millions of people together. You're ignoring the fact that there are different tribes, and they have different mentalities, and their reaction, indeed, both to Europeans hundreds of years ago and to modern political climates, is totally different. Certain tribes, for example, are fairly partisan as far as their leadership goes. Others not so much. Certain tribes run casinos, and people live in tin shacks out in the desert because the casino magnates keep them poor and drugged up, basically. In other cases, you've got almost like a hippie-ish, maybe even neo-pagan revivalism sentiment. It's more spiritual, I suppose, in a supposedly authentic sense. But this is all noble savage mythology trope bullshit. Bernie Sanders is literally delving into what initially was a literary trope from the 19th century. What happened is that people at the time were trying to quantify and categorize the human race. And so they had like broadly Western and Northern European culture. They said these are the enlightened races. And then the diaspora of Caucasians were civilized. And then you had various grades of people outside of what they considered civilization. And probably the most funny category went to people that were, in some cases, prehistoric in the sense of not having a true written language, like a modern language. Using like fucking petroglyphs and shit, but they admired their culture, they admired their bravery and their physical physique in a totally not homoerotic way, by the way, their diet, their lifestyle, and so they said they were noble savages. Oh, they're basically barbarians, but they're kind of civilized after a fashion. And they would literally go through their religions and their philosophies and try to find any way to overlap it with Christendom that they could in order to justify this categorization system. Well, this is what Sanders is doing. The idea that a person, by virtue of being a quarter Native American or whatever, is teaching you about nature, like worship the trees, respect the animals, that's bullshit, dude. That's total fucking bullshit. In fact, it's literally bigoted. There's no difference between a group of, again, so-called Native Americans and a random group of random people, black or white or Asian or whatever. There's not going to be that big a difference between the homogeneity of their ideology when it comes to respect of nature. And again, then Bernie Sanders is obviously trying to drag in the climate change thing into something that has nothing to do with it. Like the Native Americans 200 years ago were wandering around in the woods saying, you know what we need to do? We need to plant more trees because if we don't do that, nature will fall apart and the Great Spirit will abandon us and the world will cook and it'll look like Tatooine. That's not what happened. This is pure literary fiction. In the most literal sense, it's almost a verbatim retelling of the noble savage trope. And it's clearly wrong. No, the history of these, again, so-called native groups, because I was born on this continent, I'm native too. I don't care what anyone says. Stop being a fucking bigot towards us. The history of the people that were in North America at the time was intertribal warfare. There was no togetherness. There was no, oh, well, we're all one people, man, plant a tree. That never happened. They exploited land. Buffalo runs, killing, thousands of buffalo at a time for a handful of them to get used and things of that nature. And people killed each other and dragged off one another's squaws. And this is literally the history. If you look to the south, if you look at some of the Mesoamerican groups, they were conducting bloody human sacrifices on a regular basis. Now, in the literal sense, just butchering people in some cases by the hundreds in order to appease their literally bloodthirsty gods because they thought otherwise the world would end. That's the actual history there. The idea that there was some undue reverence for nature among these particular groups of people and that you have the stoic... It's sort of like a 50s, 60s Hollywood trope, too. You have the stoic strong-jawed, proud Indian chief staring off into the sunset and looking upon those evil white men destroying the land with their railroads and coal and shit like that. And a single tear is shed. And they use this as literally like pollution, anti-pollution advertising in the 70s. Look up crying Indian ad or something like that. This sort of, it's pure propaganda. It's Hollywood tropes and romanticism and a bunch of idealistic bullshit that's not real. Bernie Sanders is sitting here in 2020 basically sounding like it's 1820. To tell the truth, it's bullshit. It's a noble savage mythology. It's called a mythology for a reason. There was nothing specifically noble about any group of people in the world at the time. Everyone in the world back then lived by brutish standards, by modern standards, including the European diaspora. And the idea that this one particular group of people had some special reverence for nature, some special togetherness, is literally a misrepresentation of their entire spiritual system. And a misrepresentation, a gross mischaracterization of their history. But mention that on the Bernie Sanders tweet, and his fans will jump down your throat and pretend that you're the one being bigoted, even though their dear Führer, their socialistic leader, is literally parroting something from the... again, much like with socialism and Marxism, again, this thing that peaked in the mid-1800s, essentially, in popularity. All of these things, by the way, technically intertwined. I have literally edited literature, occult literature, no less, in which people that were socialist activists, some of which were very good authors, I will admit, literally delve into the same tropes. These things are joined at the hip. You wouldn't imagine it unless you understood the literary history of some of these anthropological writings and their various theosophical counterparts. The people at the time that were writing these sorts of things, definitely there was a noble savage mythology, and they extended it to the Hindu as well, the Vedic culture at the time, even more so, I think, than the Native Americans. Now, the noble savage mythology, the belief in human advancement, progressivism, and socialism, really, universal brotherhood sort of stuff, economically speaking. Charitable organizations. These things literally are all conjoined twins. It's amazing, actually, how it coexists in literature. Bernie Sanders is insane. He's a sick old man that doesn't understand, apparently, history at all, and believes that, again, and I can't remember who it was that I was criticizing a few months ago for basically saying the same thing. I think it was another Democratic contender, ironically, for like insinuating that people that were, before Europeans came to North America, everyone sort of wandered around in loincloths at peace, and all they did all day was they jumped around hooting and they hunted, but when they killed the animal, they sort of felt sad for it, and they were kind of animal rights activists, and they would lay hands on it, commute its spirit to heaven or whatever, and tried to be vegetarians, and they like to farm their corn. And it's like, that's not the way people lived. There was disease, there was war, that people shit themselves to death with cholera and stuff. These things were not unique to the old world. The idea that there was this special, uncontacted, unique group of people that just sort of gut it nature-wise has never been true and never will be. Yeah, you go to some hippie commune, you'll see people that are more in key with nature than anybody that was alive in the 19th century, or certainly before that. Didn't exist. It's a bunch of fucking bullshit. That's about all. Peace out.